Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective. I think it's weekend perspective. I saw a lot of these shows feel like they're weekend perspective as I'm doing them myself. Aaron's on the road traveling quite a bit, and I'm doing a little bit of traveling myself. But anyways, hope everybody's doing well. You know, something I brought up, I can't remember when it was. It was one of the year-end shows we were talking about, or if we were doing one of the Cloud News of the Months. A lot of these shows feel like they blurred together a little bit, just in terms of timing and everybody kind of getting back into the swing of things for 2026. But one of the things I mentioned was, you know, there's several rooms that I would love to be in, in 2026, especially in the AI space. There's so much going on. There's so much new things happening, and it would be really interesting to be a fly on the wall in a whole bunch of different ones. And so I picked three here as we begin 2026 that I think are going to be really, really interesting, or would be really interesting to be in. We will only get bits and pieces of this through the media and interviews and other things, but I think it'd be really interesting for a couple of different reasons. So I'm going to pick three. I may do this like once a quarter, depending on how things are going, as the market space changes and the landscape changes and sort of things happen within the marketplace. But I'm going to start for Q1. This is my kind of three rooms I would like to be in. I would like to be invited to, or like to see the whiteboards or the meeting notes in 2026. So Q1 2026, three rooms I'd like to be in. So first room, I think the most obvious room would be NVIDIA's M&A room. Right. They're sitting there at, still roughly, depending on the day, roughly $5 trillion in market capitalization. They are throwing off an enormous amount of cash. We're looking at how much CapEx, between Amazon and Meta and Google and Microsoft, they're all planning to spend in 2026. A good chunk of that will go to NVIDIA. So they're going to have, for the most part, what's going to feel like almost unlimited money, or at least, the top end of the market in terms of money. We've already seen them, make a few acquisitions. We saw, $20 billion acquisition of Grok there at the end of last year, Grok with a Q. I think that's right, Grok with a Q. Yeah, the chip company. But it would be really interesting as we think about where the market's going from them. We're seeing some people trying to figure out alternative hardware accelerators. So whether it's Google TPUs or AWS with Trainium, or Microsoft apparently has their own projects to spin stuff up. We know that there are some Chinese alternatives that are spinning up. AMD and Intel are still trying to play in that GPU game to a certain extent. So the hardware space, while NVIDIA still has a dominance, again, we've talked about this 100 times in this show, being the dominant proprietary highest end hardware provider is a difficult place to stay in for a very long time. And so it would appear that you would think that they'd likely be going after assets of a software stack, right? Assets to begin to make up whether they want to try and dominate more on the enterprise side of AI, whether it is on the consumer side of AI, probably not necessarily their play. We've begun to see them starting to release some things around autonomous driving. They made some announcements at Consumer Electronics Show around that. We've seen some things around robotics. So it would be very, very interesting, just given the vast amount of resources they have and being able to look into the future beyond chips, beyond CUDA as sort of a infrastructure layer. Where do they see the biggest bang for the buck? And probably most importantly, where do they start to see people that their customers today trying to commoditize the stack in order to move it up higher, as we've seen, over decades with different trends, where software begins to start to do that. So it'll be very interesting to see if we see them moving into a set of agentic tools, if everything they're doing becomes part of the NVIDIA AI factory, if they start to, aggressively start to try and find some of the leaders in whether it's agentic or RAG services, or, if they start to try and get into data services somehow. There's a lot of different places they could go to fill out the stack to try and do that. Do they take their software and begin to open source it in order to become sort of the de facto standard and prevent competitors from getting up in the software stack? Do we see them doubling back down and going back into some of the hosting services? Right today, they're sort of the arms dealer for those hosting services, but do they try and become more dominant in that, or do they feel like they've got that market segment pretty well wrapped up at this point? Networking is obviously doing very well for them, but they're not necessarily like in the storage space. Maybe they make an acquisition in that space. So a lot of places for them to go. It'll be very interesting to see where that goes, because that will have kind of a distinct impact on both architectural decisions that NVIDIA tries to move forward with, as well as, where their ecosystem tries to figure out where NVIDIA is going, where they can be aligned to them, where they can be adjacent to them, versus where they maybe become direct competitors to NVIDIA and AI factories and so forth. So that's my first room. Second room is, and I don't know if this would be a room necessarily, but it would be really interesting to sort of see what Anthropic's broader agentic vision looks like, right? Somewhere, I imagine Dario or, a team of folks over at Anthropic have a pretty big view of where they see the future of Claude co-work. And, we're beginning to see more and more things that, Anthropic is talking more and more about how the tools that even they're putting out have been built by agentic tools. But I think, really getting a sense of how do they expect to see agentic expand beyond sort of the coder who says, hey, I run 10 instances of something, right? Where do they expect to see this go in terms of, orchestration of these things? Where do we expect to see them go in terms of being able to collaborate across teams, share learnings within agents, all of those sorts of things? Where do we see that in a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? What's the bigger vision of where they see all of this going? I think that would be really, really interesting, because it's going to very much be a big piece of the puzzle as Claude has begun to take a very dominant position in the software developer space. Did they move downstream into sort of the no coding type of tools, right? And that's sort of where Claude Cowork is beginning to go. But do we see that start to expand out into spaces? Do they start creating entirely different paradigms of how vertical specific lawyers think about how to solve a case, or financial teams think about how to build tooling to help them better predict markets, or do stress testing, or do rapid closing of the books at the end of the month? All those sort of vertical niche types of things that are sort of technology oriented. They're not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily think of them as like developer oriented, but there are plenty of sort of spreadsheet experts within all those sort of different jobs that could transfer over into something that becomes agentic. Do we see a different type of agentic happen in marketing campaigns? We're already beginning to see that around advertising, but do we see it in terms of market understanding, competitive intelligence, all those sorts of things? So I think that would be very, very fascinating to see where that goes, because the better sense you have of what that looks like, the better sense you have of what are the future economics going to look like around not only software developers, but sort of software development teams that are hybrid of humans and agents. What does the optimal number of agents or ongoing projects per human software developer look like? What do we start to see that look like? What tools are they going to put in place to allow that to become more optimized, more flexible, allow more experimentation to happen? So I think that would be a fascinating room to be in. It would be a fascinating room to, sort of see not only what their immediate roadmap looks like, but, what are some of the experiments they're thinking about over the next year, 2 years, right? What are they doing to bring in industry-specific experts to sort of help them in that domain? What kind of conversations are they having with early customers about what they think the pricing might look like for these services as they evolve over time, as they become potentially more expert or more able to work for long periods of time on more complex problems? What does it look like for a, sort of a swarm team trying to solve biological problems or chemistry problems or, physics problems or things along those lines? So I think that would be a fascinating place to be sort of a fly on the wall. And then my third one for this Q1 kind of falls in line a little bit with the CapEx discussion we talked about with NVIDIA's. But I think the third, most fascinating place would be the TSMC sort of 2028 to 2030 planning room. In their space, they just announced they are basically doubling their CapEx for, the next couple of years, or, for the next year. But obviously they have to think in 3 and 5 year increments in terms of building capacity, building space, being able to retrofit to new processor levels in terms of sizing and so forth. So it would be fascinating to sort of get a sense from them, what sort of demand are they forecasting? Where do they see potential bumps in their forecast? Where do they see potential changes happening to the technology landscape that might create breakthroughs that are, while they're not necessarily going to be the designer of that chipset, but where do they see across their design partners a potentially new innovation happening that could either significantly reduce cost of the accelerator chipsets or associated chipsets? Where do they see potential yield growth going up and so forth? Are they seeing any bottlenecks that they're running into that might restrict the ability or create situations in which the current sort of forecast for growth is going to run into bumps? For example, we've seen some things where we've seen certain failures with certain chipsets on training, maybe more so than others. And that's caused some delays in terms of some of the frontier models coming out. So, it'd be very, very interesting to sort of see where they see the broader market, where they're seeing forecasts for things, where they're seeing, so both capacity forecast, how they're tracking, usage forecast to make sure that they're aligned to what their customers are asking for. But it would be fascinating to sort of look at all of that, not to mention, how they are hedging, with the challenges going on with rare metals in the marketplace, the sort of spike in certain commodity prices that have been happening that could impact their thing. So it would be very, very interesting to look at, just kind of the breadth of all of the variables that they're trying to take into consideration over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And then really kind of look at the calculations for, why is, kind of the central company for building hardware, which right now is sort of the lifeblood for these AI projects, so much lower than what we're seeing even just in terms of, the big 4 or 5, cloud and AI companies in terms of their projections for the next year. So be fascinating to sort of, look at that. But yeah, I think if we look at the three of those, kind of, where do we see NVIDIA trying to spread out? If they're trying to spread out and move into adjacent markets, where do we see Anthropic really trying to completely redefine what not only software development looks like, but sort of work, the expansion and productivity of work around agents? And then finally, what TSMC is planning as sort of the core, most important central piece in terms of, all this capacity that has been forecasted and demanded, and to a certain extent, is being, overwhelming the market in terms of that. So those are my 3 for Q1. We'll probably come back and do this as a regular thing. Maybe every quarter we'll look at, 3 rooms that we would love to be in and 3 kind of unknowns that, we would love to get a little bit more clarity on. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend, and we will be back and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.